You are walking through a city built of wood and thatch centuries ago. The narrow streets wind around you, dark and unfamiliar. Suddenly, a cry pierces the night air. Smoke, thick and acrid, begins to drift through the alleys. An orange glow pulses in the distance, growing larger, brighter, faster than you can believe. This is not a contained blaze. This is a city about to be consumed. Tonight, we journey back to a time when fire was a terrifying, almost unstoppable force. You will discover the forgotten heroes, the very first firefighters, who faced unimaginable horrors with nothing but courage and crude tools. Their battle was not just against flames but against panic, disease, and the very structure of their world, all eager to collapse around them. You feel the heat rising now, not just from the unseen inferno, but from the dense, pressing atmosphere of a city on the brink. Imagine standing here centuries ago, your eyes scanning the skyline. What do you see? Not the stone and steel of our modern cities, but a sprawling patchwork quilt of timber, wattle and daub and straw. Every single structure, from the grandest guild hall to the humblest lean-to, a potential torch awaiting a spark. The very air you breathe is thick with the scent of wood smoke, a constant reminder of the ever-present danger. Homes were built shoulder to shoulder, their eaves almost touching, creating dark, winding canyons for streets. You could reach out and touch the house opposite yours from an upper window. These narrow passages, so quaint in storybooks, were death traps in reality. They channeled the winds, acting like bellows for any nascent flame, fanning it with terrifying efficiency. A fire that began in one kitchen could, in mere moments, leap across an alley, engulfing an entire block. Water, the essential enemy of fire, was a precious commodity, not a readily available defense. There were no hydrants, no vast underground networks of pipes. You would have relied on communal wells, river access, or perhaps a hand-dug cistern. Imagine the desperate scramble to fetch water. A single bucket, carried by hand, perhaps passed along a rudimentary chain of panicked citizens. One bucket, against a wall of flame taller than any house, hotter than any forge. It was a futile gesture, an act of sheer desperation. The initial alarm itself was a frantic, chaotic affair. No 911, no sophisticated signaling. It was the frantic ringing of church bells, a designated peal to signify fire, a cacophony that mingled with the shouts of watchmen and the terrified screams of those caught nearest the blaze. You would have woken to that sound, a jolt of ice through your veins, knowing instinctively what it meant. The ringing of the bells was not a call to a professional brigade, but a plea to the entire community. It was a summons for everyone, every able-bodied person, to drop whatever they were doing and rush to the scene. And what would you find there? A scene of utter pandemonium. Men and women, young and old, running in every direction. Some, bravely or foolishly, trying to save their own possessions, dragging chests and furniture into the street, only for them to become obstacles for others trying to escape. Others, gripped by terror, simply fleeing, adding to the confusion. You would see faces contorted with fear, illuminated by the flickering, growing light of the fire. The sheer scale of human chaos was a force almost as destructive as the fire itself. The tools available were rudimentary at best. If you were a citizen responding to the alarm, you might grab a leather bucket, perhaps a simple axe. Some communities might have had long poles with hooks, designed to pull down burning thatch or to tear apart timbers. But these were individual efforts, uncoordinated and often counterproductive. Imagine trying to dismantle a burning building with a handful of villagers and a few axes, while the flames roar and smoke chokes your lungs. It was less a strategic defense and more a primal struggle. One of the most drastic yet often necessary strategies was the creation of fire breaks. This meant the deliberate destruction of buildings in the path of the fire. Picture this grim task. You are standing there watching your neighbors, perhaps even helping them, hack away at the very foundations of homes. Not to save them, but to create a gap, a space where the fire would theoretically run out of fuel. Imagine the screams, the protests, The sheer physical and emotional toll of tearing down someone's life's work, knowing it was the only slim chance to save the rest of the city. These were often the very homes of the poor, sacrificed to protect wealthier districts. The moral implications were profound, and the decision often came too late, made in the very shadow of the advancing inferno. The psychological impact of such a fire was overwhelming. It wasn't just the loss of property or life, it was the loss of safety, the shattering of the fragile order of daily existence. Superstition ran rampant. Was this fire a divine judgment? A curse? A demonic visitation? In an age before scientific understanding of combustion, fire often felt like an angry, living entity, an unstoppable beast devouring everything in its path. You would feel a profound sense of helplessness, a stark realization of humanity's insignificance against the raw power of nature. The very air became toxic. Beyond the heat and the smoke, the burning of wood, thatch, tar, and all the diverse contents of homes and workshops released a deadly cocktail of fumes. You would struggle for breath, your eyes streaming, your throat raw. The dense smoke reduced visibility to mere feet, disorienting those trying to escape or fight. People didn't just burn, they suffocated, trapped in a maze of flames and an impenetrable cloud of blackness. When a major fire struck a city, it was not merely an incident. It was a societal catastrophe. Entire districts could vanish in a single night. The poor, with their flimsy dwellings and lack of resources, were often the first to lose everything. They became refugees in their own city, displaced and destitute, crowding into temporary camps or relying on the charity of those who still had homes. Disease often followed in the wake of such devastation, festering in the unsanitary conditions created by so many displaced people. The economy of a city could be crippled for years, even decades, as vital businesses and trade routes were incinerated. You understand now, perhaps, why the very mention of fire could strike such terror into the hearts of medieval and early modern Europeans. It was an uncontrolled predator, lurking in every hearth, every candle flame, every stray spark from a blacksmith's forge. There was no professional safety net, no immediate, organized response. Just a chaotic, desperate struggle by ordinary citizens, often ill-equipped, often too late, against an enemy that consumed everything it touched. The scale of the destruction could be truly biblical, wiping away generations of growth and construction in a single fiery night. This was the landscape of peril, the urban tinderbox, where the concept of firefighting was still in its embryonic stages. It was from this crucible of chaos and devastation that the first glimmerings of organized defense against fire would emerge. The sheer scale of these disasters, the lessons learned through agonizing loss, would slowly, painstakingly force communities to rethink their approach. They had to move beyond the individual bucket and the desperate axe. They had to find a way to stand together, to organize, to truly battle the beast. You stand in the shadows of ancient Rome, a sprawling metropolis of close-packed insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that tower over narrow, winding streets. Night falls, and with it comes a different kind of quiet, punctuated by distant chatter, the occasional clatter of a cart, and the ever-present hum of a city that never truly sleeps. But even in this relative calm, a new kind of guardian is stirring, emerging from the necessity of those very disasters we just explored. Rome, for all its engineering marvels and military might, was also a city perpetually on the brink of immolation. The emperors knew this. The people lived it. A unified defense against the consuming beast was finally needed. It was the great Augustus, the first true emperor, who, after several devastating fires that laid waste to vast swathes of the city, finally established a permanent, organized fire brigade and night watch. He called them the Vigiles Urbani, the watchmen of the city. Imagine this. For centuries, the only response to fire was the desperate, uncoordinated efforts of neighbors, slaves, or small, private forces. Now you have a dedicated, state-sponsored force. You are walking down a cobblestone street, the air thick with the smell of olive oil lamps and perhaps the lingering scent of last night's meals. You might glimpse a group of men moving purposefully through the darkness. These are the vigiles, the silent sentinels of Rome. They are Rome's first professional firefighters, but their role extends far beyond merely dousing flames. They are also the city's police force after dark, its vigilant guardians against crime, and its keepers of public order. You see them, cloaked figures, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight, patrolling the 8-mile radius of the city. There are 7 cohorts, each comprising 1,000 men, assigned to 2 of Rome's 14 administrative regions. A formidable number, you might think, but against a city housing well over 1 million souls, packed into thousands of often rickety, flammable structures, their resources are stretched desperately thin. Each man is responsible for an enormous area, a testament to the sheer scale of the imperial task. Consider their training, their equipment. These are often former slaves, freedmen, or citizens from the lower ranks, a testament to the tough, demanding, and sometimes thankless nature of the job. They sign on for years of service, earning a meager but steady wage, a guaranteed if dangerous livelihood. For many, it represented a path to citizenship or a stable, if arduous, career. As you follow one of these patrols, you notice their tools. No gleaming, brass-plated modern apparatus here. Instead, they carry buckets, simple wooden or leather buckets, ready to be filled at the nearest public fountain or cistern. They have axes not just for breaking down doors, but more often for demolishing entire sections of buildings to create fire breaks, a brutal but often necessary strategy. And you might see their siphons, rudimentary hand-operated pumps designed to spray water, not with powerful jets, but with a steady, if less forceful, stream. They also carry hooks, long heavy tools for pulling down burning timbers or even entire walls. And vinegar. Gallons of it. A strange choice, you might think, but ancient wisdom suggested it could douse flames or help clear smoke. They are equipped with ropes and ladders, too, essential for navigating the vertical challenge of Roman insulae, often 5 or 6 stories high. You imagine a long, uneventful night, the kind that forms the majority of a vigilis's life. Hours upon hours of trudging through narrow alleyways, the air sometimes stale, sometimes carrying the faint odor of sewage or refuse, listening for the telltale crackle of a hidden fire, or the shouts of a brawl. You feel the chill of the Roman night seep into your bones, the weariness in your feet, the dull ache in your shoulders from carrying your equipment. Most nights are like this, quiet, tedious, a monotonous vigil against threats that often do not materialize. You are always watching for the careless lamp left burning on a windowsill, the overloaded brazier radiating too much heat, the illegal hearth in an upper-story apartment. Your eyes scan the rooftops, searching for that telltale shimmer of heat, that wisp of smoke caught on the breeze. A false alarm, a shadow playing tricks, and your heart would leap. Is this it? Then, the slow calming of your nerves and back to the endless patrol. This is the sleepy aspect, the constant low-level alertness that can easily drift into dullness, making the sudden burst of terror all the more jarring. Then the alarm. A piercing cry of incendium, fire. The sound rips through the night, echoing off the stone and plaster, a primal scream of danger. You would run, adrenaline surging through your veins, your training taking over, every ounce of weariness vanishing in an instant. The chaotic scene that greets you is overwhelming. Smoke billows from a multi-story building, its upper floors already engulfed in orange light, licking at the dark sky. People are screaming, scrambling down rickety wooden staircases, or trapped on balconies, their faces stark with terror. You and your fellow vigiles rush to the scene, forming bucket brigades stretching back to the nearest water source, shouting orders that are barely heard over the roar of the flames and the cries of the crowd. The air is thick with acrid smoke, stinging your eyes, burning your lungs. The heat is intense, radiating from the inferno, searing your skin, singeing your hair and clothes. Your task is not just to put out the fire but to save lives. You see a family trapped on a third-floor balcony, huddled together as flames lick at the windows below them. One vigilist attempts to scale a precarious ladder. Another tries to find a path through the burning interior, knowing that every moment is critical. The danger is immense. Buildings can collapse without warning, their wooden frames and lightweight construction making them terribly vulnerable, raining down burning debris. The smoke can overcome you in an instant, silently stealing your breath. You might see a colleague fall, trapped beneath a falling beam, or succumb to toxic fumes. This is the horror, the brutal reality hidden beneath the boring, repetitive patrols. This is where the sleepy sentinels become heroes or martyrs. Beyond firefighting, their duties as night watchmen are equally varied and often mundane, yet crucial for urban stability. You might be tasked with apprehending a petty thief, or breaking up a drunken street brawl that threatens to escalate. You could be searching for runaway slaves, a grim duty but one expected of you. You are the eyes and ears of Rome after dark, reporting everything from suspicious gatherings to structural weaknesses in public buildings. The emperor himself relies on your reports, your constant vigilance, a cornerstone of his control over the vast city. You are the thin line between order and chaos, between a sleeping city and the eruption of lawlessness. The living conditions for the vigiles are austere. They live in barracks, usually co-located with their stations, strategically placed throughout the city to ensure rapid response times. You might imagine the cramped quarters, the simple cot beds, the shared meals of bread and porridge, the constant camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared danger and shared boredom. It is a life of discipline, of waiting, of preparing for the worst. Their pay, while regular, barely covers the cost of living in an expensive city like Rome. It is a testament to their dedication, or perhaps their limited options, that they remain in service, facing the inherent dangers night after night. Yet, despite their best efforts, Rome still burned. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, during Nero's reign, stands as a chilling testament to the limitations of the vigiles and the sheer scale of urban vulnerability. For 9 days the city was a raging inferno. You can only imagine the utter helplessness of the vigiles during such an event, their buckets and siphons utterly inadequate against a firestorm that consumed entire districts. Even with the emperor's vast resources, every available man pressed into service, the beast devoured Rome, leaving behind a scarred, smoldering landscape. So, as you walk these ancient streets in your mind, you begin to understand the silent burden carried by these men. The vigiles. Rome's first professional firefighters, its weary night watchmen, its guardians against a silent enemy that could erupt at any moment. They are not the celebrated legionaries marching in triumph, nor the powerful senators debating laws. They are the men who walk the shadows, who stand watch while the city sleeps, knowing that at any moment, the peace could shatter into 1,000 fiery fragments. Their story is one of thankless duty, of quiet heroism, and of the constant, unyielding struggle to keep a vibrant, yet volatile city from devouring itself. You can almost feel the weight of that responsibility, a burden as ancient as the city walls themselves, a responsibility that stretches from the flickering lamplight of Rome to the modern world's organized response to emergency. You stand now on the cusp of disaster, not merely a common house fire, but a conflagration that would sear itself into the very bedrock of history, forever linking the horror of urban blazes with the caprice of imperial power. Imagine Rome not just as a city of grand monuments, but as a sprawling, breathing organism, constantly susceptible to the smallest spark. Its lifeblood flowed through narrow, winding alleyways, where multi-story apartment blocks, known as insulae, leaned precariously against one another. These structures, often shoddily built from timber and mud brick, were tinderboxes waiting for a flame. The air itself, especially in summer, hung heavy with the scent of human activity, of cooking fires, of refuse, of the damp earth beneath the cobblestones. You feel the constant hum of the city around you, 1,000 tiny fires burning daily for cooking, for light, for warmth. each one a potential genesis for destruction. And then, one sweltering summer night in the year 64 of the Common Era, that potential became a terrifying reality. The Great Fire of Rome did not begin with a roar, but perhaps a whisper, a flicker. It started, historians believe, in the merchant area near the Circus Maximus, where shops stored oil, cloth, and highly flammable goods. You can almost hear the first screams of alarm, muffled at first, then rising to a panicked crescendo as the flames took hold. The wind, it is said, was against Rome that night, fanning the infant blaze into a monstrous entity. The vigiles, Rome's weary firefighters, would have been immediately summoned. You picture them, roused from their barracks, grabbing their buckets, axes, and siphons. Their training would have kicked in, their discipline honed over decades of lesser blazes. But this was different. This was not a single burning insula they could contain. This was a beast unleashed. The fire spread with a horrifying speed. You can feel the intense heat radiating even from a distance, smell the acrid smoke stinging your eyes and burning your throat. Imagine the terror as the flames leaped from building to building, consuming wooden balconies and straw roofs in seconds. The tightly packed nature of Rome, usually its strength, became its greatest vulnerability. There were no wide fire breaks, no open spaces to halt the inferno's relentless march. The vigiles would have been overwhelmed, stretched thin, their usual tactics rendered almost useless. Their siphons, ingenious as they were, could not project enough water to fight such a vast front. Their axes and grappling hooks, typically used to pull down burning timbers, would have been deployed desperately, attempting to create fire breaks by demolishing entire sections of buildings. You see them silhouetted against the lurid orange glow, swinging their tools, sweat streaming down their soot-stained faces, their breath ragged with exertion and smoke inhalation. The horrors they faced were beyond anything they had ever encountered. The roar of the fire would have been deafening, punctuated by the terrifying crash of collapsing walls and the screams of trapped citizens. They would have seen people leaping from upper stories, making impossible choices between incineration and a desperate plunge to the streets below. They would have battled falling embers, superheated air that scorched their lungs, and a suffocating blanket of smoke that reduced visibility to mere inches. The job of a vigil, always dangerous, became a suicidal mission. For 6 days and 7 nights the fire raged. You witnessed the scale of the destruction. Entire districts reduced to smoking rubble. The once vibrant heart of Rome, now a charred wasteland. The vigiles, exhausted and demoralized, could only watch in horror as their efforts seemed futile against such an immense force. Their job transitioned from fighting the fire to rescuing survivors, clearing paths, and attempting to bring a semblance of order to the chaos. And then, amid the ashes and despair, the shadow of Emperor Nero began to loom large. Rumors, insidious and damning, started to circulate. Some whispered that Nero himself had ordered the city set alight, fueled by a desire to rebuild Rome in his own image, perhaps even to clear land for a grander palace, his Domus Aurea. The stories painted a picture of a callous emperor, perched on a rooftop, fiddling his lyre while his city burned, captivated by the spectacle of destruction. You understand the power of such rumors, how they can take root in the fertile ground of fear and suspicion. Whether Nero truly played his lyre, or whether he was even in Rome at the time, became less important than the perception. He was seen as aloof, perhaps even complicit. The imperial response, instead of inspiring confidence, became a source of further anxiety and resentment. Even though Nero did organize relief efforts, providing shelter and food for the displaced, his actions were viewed through a cynical lens. He quickly initiated a massive rebuilding program, enacting stricter building codes to prevent future fires, mandating the use of fire-resistant materials and widening streets. These measures, sensible and necessary, were overshadowed by the whispers that he had caused the very disaster he was now fixing. The reconstruction, for all its improvements, also included Nero's extravagant golden house, a sprawling palace complex that many saw as a selfish monument built on the ashes of their homes. This perception of imperial indifference, or worse, imperial culpability, deepened the cracks in Nero's already fragile public image. And then came the scapegoat. To deflect the blame, Nero turned his fury upon a fledgling religious sect, the Christians. You can feel the chilling injustice of it. They were accused of setting the fire, arrested, tortured, and brutally executed in public spectacles. This horrific act, meant to restore Nero's popularity, instead cemented his reputation as a cruel and tyrannical ruler. It marked a dark chapter in imperial history, showcasing how urban disaster could be twisted into political persecution. For the Vigiles, the aftermath of the Great Fire would have been a profoundly grim experience. Their dedication, their bravery, their sacrifices in the face of an impossible enemy were largely unacknowledged, overshadowed by the political intrigue and the emperor's desperate attempts to control the narrative. They returned to their duties, patrolling the smoldering ruins, guarding against further outbreaks, and assisting in the long, arduous process of rebuilding. The memory of the fire, though, would forever haunt the city and its protectors. It highlighted the intrinsic vulnerability of even the greatest empire to the simplest, yet most devastating forces of nature, compounded by human error, political ambition, and outright malice. The horrors faced by these first firefighters were not just the flames and collapsing timbers, but also the crushing weight of public despair, the emperor's shifting blame, and the chilling realization that even their tireless efforts could be swept away by an inferno, both physical and political. The fiery fury of Rome's greatest blaze became inextricably linked with the fiery fury of an emperor's decaying power, leaving a permanent scar on the fabric of the city and the spirit of its people. The searing memory of Rome's inferno and the emperor's failing grip marks a turning point, not just for the city, but for the very idea of public safety. For centuries, the Roman Empire maintained a formidable, if imperfect, system for combating fire, a beacon of organized protection. But as the empire faltered and crumbled, so too did the intricate structures that once protected its people. You step from vibrant imperial Rome into a darkening landscape, often called the Dark Ages. The familiar vigiles, disciplined sentinels against the flame, fade into history, replaced by a profound, terrifying void. This is the post-Roman gap, centuries where sophisticated systems ceased to exist, leaving communities vulnerable on an unimaginable scale. Imagine yourself on the outskirts of what was once a Roman settlement. Aqueducts lie broken, their flow reduced to a trickle. Grand stone buildings cracked, tiles fallen. The concept of central authority for a professional fire brigade has vanished. Roman firefighting infrastructure, paved roads, public water sources, trained personnel, all withered. You walk down a narrow, muddy track, not a Roman road, barely wide enough for a cart. Dense urban centers largely depopulated, replaced by smaller, more vulnerable clusters of dwellings. These settlements, around a fort or monastery, presented a new kind of fire hazard, equally devastating. Local leaders held tenuous sway, their concerns immediate survival, defense, food, and rudimentary order. Fire suppression was a luxury no one could afford or even conceive of in this chaotic new reality. The architecture you see contrasts starkly with Rome's stone. Timber reigns supreme. Houses are wood with thatched roofs of straw or reeds. They are built close, sometimes sharing walls, eaves almost touching across narrow, winding pathways. Open hearths for cooking and heating are central, their sparks a constant, insidious threat. Chimneys, if they exist, are rudimentary, allowing smoke and embers to escape into flammable roof space or out into the open air where wind could carry them. Candles, rushlights, and oil lamps provide the only illumination, each a tiny flame ready to leap out of control. You can almost smell the wood smoke perpetually hanging, a mix of cooking fires and damp timber decay. The soundscape differs. Roman commerce's clamor is replaced by creaking wooden carts, distant livestock, and daily life in a close-knit, perilously exposed community. No fire alarm, no organized patrol like the vigiles. If a fire starts, it is discovered by chance. A wisp of smoke, a crackle of burning thatch, or a neighbor's terrified scream. A fire's speed through such a settlement was terrifyingly swift. Imagine a late autumn night, a strong wind whipping through the village. A spark from a cooking fire catches dry thatch. Within moments, flames lick greedily at the straw, sending plumes of smoke and showers of burning embers into the night sky. One house ignites, then another. The close proximity of wooden structures ensures rapid, relentless advance. The communal response was desperate and futile. You hear the piercing cry of a watchman or the frantic ringing of a church bell, a general alarm, not just for raiders but for the inferno. Everyone, men, women, children, would rush out, not with disciplined tools, but with whatever they could grab: buckets, pitchers, cloth. The aim was simple: throw water, sand, or dirt onto the flames. But water sources were limited: a shared well, a nearby stream. The human chain passing buckets was slow and inefficient. No strategy, no leadership beyond a village elder's panicked instructions. Priorities shifted from fighting fire to saving lives and retrieving possessions. Livestock would stampede, adding chaos. The air would fill with acrid burning wood, frantic cries, desperate animal lowing. The heat would be intense, forcing everyone back from their burning homes. The horrors in this post-Roman gap were not just the fires but helplessness. A single ember, a moment of carelessness, could wipe out a village, rendering dozens or hundreds homeless instantly. No insurance, no relief agency, no centralized government aid. Loss of a home meant loss of livelihood, stored food, and shelter. A winter fire could be a death sentence for the old, sick, and young. The psychological impact was profound. Without understanding combustion, fires were often seen as acts of God, divine retribution, or malevolent spirits. This fostered fatalism, a belief that disasters were beyond human control. While prayers were offered, practical preventative measures were sporadic and localized, lacking the comprehensive approach of the Roman vigiles. You would live with constant anxiety, knowing that at any moment your entire world could turn to ash. This period, stretching for centuries after Rome's fall, represents a dramatic step backward in organized fire protection. Collective knowledge and institutional memory of effective fire suppression largely disappeared. Communities were forced to rediscover, through bitter experience and devastating loss, the fundamental truths about fire: its speed, its hunger, and the overwhelming power it holds over human endeavor when unchecked. The watchman's call was a cry of alarm, not a signal for coordinated, effective response. It was a warning that destruction was upon them, and all they could do was flee or salvage before silent ash settled over everything they had built. The landscape was scarred by frequent, uncontrolled blazes. You might see blackened timbers of a former home, a skeletal reminder, or the empty plot where houses once stood, overgrown. The resilience of these communities was immense, as they would often rebuild, sometimes on the very ashes, only to face the same risk again. This cycle of destruction and rebuilding defined much of the urban experience throughout the early and high Middle Ages. The lessons from this dark period, however, would eventually sow seeds for change. The frequency and scale of these disasters forced communities to think differently, to move beyond fatalism and towards more proactive measures. Rudimentary communal efforts, bucket lines, church bells, watchmen, were the first fragile shoots of a renewed public consciousness regarding fire safety. They were a far cry from the disciplined vigiles, but they were a beginning. You can almost feel the slow, painful grind of human ingenuity re-emerging, driven by the stark reality of survival. The silent ash of countless lost homes and lives became the foundation upon which, centuries later, new forms of organized protection would arise. But for now, for this long drawn-out epic, the horror was in the waiting, the watching, and the knowledge that when the flames came, you were largely, terrifyingly alone. You stand at the edge of the market square as dusk deepens, the last embers of the day fading behind the crooked rooftops. The air grows sharp with the chill of evening, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. A profound silence begins to settle, broken only by the distant bleating of a goat or the gentle creak of a closing shutter. But this quiet is an illusion, a fragile peace that holds the breath of the city. Soon, a new sound will pierce the gathering gloom, a rhythmic clang that marks the transition from the weary day to the watchful night. You hear it first as a subtle vibration in the cobblestones, then a faint, sonorous peal. It grows steadily louder, a deliberate, measured beat. Clang, clang, clang. This is the sound of the bellman, the night watchman, beginning his rounds. He is Europe's first line of defense against the most common and devastating horror of the medieval town, fire. His job is thankless, dangerous, and often monotonous, yet absolutely vital. Imagine you are one of these men. You pull your thick, homespun cloak tighter around your shoulders, the fabric coarse against your skin. A heavy iron bell hangs from your belt, its clapper worn smooth from countless nights of announcing your presence. In your hand, a horn lantern flickers, casting a small, dancing circle of light that pushes back the oppressive darkness of the narrow alleyways. The town sleeps, or at least pretends to, but you are wide awake, your senses sharpened. Your route is a labyrinth, a maze of unpaved streets and timber-framed buildings that lean precariously over your head. The smell of human waste mingles with the faint aroma of stale ale and the comforting scent of wood fires banked for the night. You walk with purpose, your heavy boots thudding softly on the uneven ground. Every shadow is a potential hiding place, every unlatched door a concern. Crime is as much a threat as fire in these unlit hours. You are a sentinel not just against flame, but against the petty thief and the lurking brigand. The primary duty, though the one that presses heaviest on your mind, is fire. You scan the rooftops constantly, your eyes straining to catch any telltale shimmer, any wisp of smoke that should not be there. You know that a single spark, a forgotten candle, a poorly maintained hearth, could ignite a catastrophe that would consume homes, livelihoods, and lives. The memory of past fires, the acrid smell of burning wood and flesh, lingers in the collective consciousness of the town. You carry that burden with every step. As you walk, you announce the hours, your voice a gravelly drone in the stillness. Past 9 of the clock and a fair night, you call out, the words echoing briefly before being swallowed by the silence. This is more than just a time check. It is a reassurance to those behind closed doors, a declaration that someone is watching, that order is being maintained, however tenuously. Your bell is not just an alarm, it is a lullaby for a nervous populace. Your pay is meager, barely enough to keep your own small household fed and clothed. Your social standing is low, often seen as a necessary but undesirable fixture of the town. You are a solitary figure, moving through a world asleep, an outsider peering into the fleeting warmth of other people's homes through gaps in shutters or the glow from a window. Loneliness is a constant companion on your rounds. The cold seeps into your bones. The nights are long, stretching from sunset to sunrise. There is no warmth, no companionship, only the endless patrol. You learn to read the subtle signs of the city at night, the changing wind direction, the faint cries of nocturnal animals, the sudden silence that sometimes precedes trouble. Your ears become attuned to every unusual sound, a distant shout, the frantic scrabble of rats in the thatch, or worst of all, the crackle that signifies an uncontrolled blaze. When you do spot a fire, the monotony shatters instantly. Your heart leaps into your throat and a cold dread grips your stomach. You do not hesitate. You begin to ring your bell frantically, a wild, clanging peal that is distinct from your regular rhythmic announcement of the hour. This is the alarm, the sound that stirs the town from its uneasy sleep. Then you shout, your voice hoarse, fire. Fire in the high street, or fire by the tanner's guild. You point, you run, you direct the first sleepy, panicked citizens who spill from their homes, still half-dressed, grasping buckets and axes. You are the first responder, the initial spark that ignites the town's communal, chaotic efforts. There are no specialized fire brigades as we know them. There are only you, your bell, and the collective will of the people. Your warning is the signal for bucket lines to form, for valuable goods to be dragged into the street, for the desperate work of demolishing adjacent buildings to create a firebreak. You watch, helpless in a way, as the small ember you spotted turns into a raging inferno, swallowing timber and thatch with terrifying speed. You know your role is to warn, but the actual battle is fought by everyone, and often, it is a losing one. As the sun begins to lighten the eastern sky, casting pale hues across the smoke-stained ruins, you are still there, exhausted, your throat raw from shouting, your ears ringing from the frantic bell. The immediate danger might have passed, but the devastation remains. You have done your duty, but the scale of the destruction often dwarfs your solitary efforts. Despite the inherent dangers and the thankless nature of their work, these medieval bellmen and watchmen were the unsung heroes of urban survival. Their persistent, solitary vigilance, night after night, was a critical, early form of community protection against the omnipresent threat of fire. They were not equipped with hoses or sophisticated pumps, but with their bells, their lanterns, and their tireless commitment, they represented the slow, painful evolution of human society's response to disaster. You can almost feel the weight of that responsibility, the chilling cold of a medieval night, and the constant, nagging fear of seeing that first terrible flicker of flame. You are utterly alone in the darkness, yet carrying the safety of an entire town in your watchful eyes. Their patrols were more than just a deterrent. They were a ritual, a tangible symbol that the community was not entirely at the mercy of chance. Each clang of the bell, each shouted announcement of the hour, was a thread in the fabric of a fragile order. You might dismiss them as rudimentary, their methods laughably simple by modern standards, but in their time they were essential. Without these dedicated souls, without their unwavering presence on the cold, dark streets, the ravages of fire would have been even more frequent, even more devastating. Consider the immense psychological toll. Day after day, year after year, these men walked, their bodies growing weary, their spirits perhaps dulled by the repetitive nature of the task. Yet, one mistake, one moment of inattention could cost them everything: their job, their reputation, and worst of all, the lives of their neighbors. The pressure was immense, an invisible burden carried alongside the heavy bell and the dim lantern. You might imagine yourself huddled by a flickering fire in your own home, safe and warm, and then hear the bellman's voice pass by your window. There is a primal comfort in that sound, a reassurance that someone else is out there, braving the elements, keeping watch. It's a sound that connects the sleeping individual to the conscious vigilance of the community. In an age devoid of electric light, of instant communication, that voice and that bell were the only reliable signals of the passing night and the potential for danger. Their world was a symphony of natural sounds and human industry. You might hear the distant howl of a wolf from outside the city walls, or the soft murmur of the river. But above it all, or interwoven with it, was the regular rhythmic clang of the bellman. He was the human heartbeat of the sleeping town, a vital pulse against the encroaching darkness. He knew every twist and turn of the streets, every shortcut through an alley, every potentially hazardous corner where refuse might pile up and become a fire risk. His knowledge was intimate, born of countless hours of silent observation. The tools of his trade, simple as they were extensions of his will. The bell was his voice, carrying through the still air. The lantern was his eye, penetrating the gloom. His stout staff, often carried for balance and defense, was his arm ready to fend off threats. These were not sophisticated instruments of prevention, but rather instruments of detection and alarm. His effectiveness lay almost entirely in his attentiveness and the speed of his reaction. So, when you reflect on the terrors faced by early European towns, remember the bellman. Remember the cold, the darkness, the constant fear of fire, and the solitude. He represents a humble but critical step in the long and arduous journey towards organized fire protection. He was not a hero in shining armor, but a weary figure cloaked in darkness, ringing his bell, hoping that tonight, just tonight, the only sound he would need to make was his announcement of the hour, and not the frantic peal of a fire alarm. His rounds were unthankful but essential. And as you imagine his footsteps fading into the night, you realize the true weight of living in a world where the protection against catastrophe rested largely on the shoulders of one lone, vigilant soul. The next time you consider the immense destructive power of fire in an age of wood and thatch, think of the individual who patrolled those streets. Think of the watchman, the bellman, whose unceasing, isolated vigil was the best and often only defense. His story, though often overlooked, is central to understanding the evolution of urban safety and the profound challenges faced by medieval communities. He stands as a testament to the basic human need for order and protection, even when that protection is as simple as a bell and a voice in the dark. The watchman's bell, a solitary warning against the encroaching darkness, would shatter the silence of the night. Its frantic, urgent peal was not merely an announcement of danger, it was a desperate plea for action. And as that sound reverberated through the sleeping streets, you would feel a jolt of terror, a sickening lurch in your stomach, for you knew what it truly meant. Fire. Not a contained hearth fire, but a raging beast threatening to consume everything you held dear. Imagine yourself roused from a deep sleep, the air suddenly thick with the acrid scent of smoke, the night sky now a terrifying canvas of flickering orange and angry red. The bellman's cry, now joined by the shouts of neighbors, pulls you from your bed. There is no time for thought, only instinct. You rush into the street, heart pounding, your breath catching in your throat as the true scale of the disaster begins to unfold before your very eyes. In this age, there were no professional fire brigades, no battalions of trained individuals equipped with modern apparatus. The fight against fire was a collective, chaotic, and often futile endeavor undertaken by every able-bodied person. When the alarm sounded, the entire community became the fire department. You and your neighbors, your guild members, even passing strangers, would be pressed into service. It was a scramble, a disorganized surge of humanity against an indifferent, hungry force. What did you have at your disposal? What weapons did this impromptu army wield against such a formidable foe? The answer, heartbreakingly, was very little. Your arsenal was primitive, rudimentary, and overwhelmingly insufficient. The most common and emblematic tool was the humble bucket. Picture it, heavy leather buckets, some made of wood, often lined with pitch to make them waterproof. These were your primary means of assault. No high-pressure hoses, no vast reservoirs. Just buckets. And the method of deployment was equally ancient, the human chain. You would find yourself standing shoulder to shoulder with dozens, perhaps hundreds of others. A line stretching from the nearest water source, a well, a communal pump, a river, or even a dirty street gutter, all the way to the burning building. Hands calloused, muscles straining, you would pass the heavy, sloshing buckets one by one. The water, often meager and contaminated, would be thrown, splashed, or poured onto the inferno. Think of the sheer effort. Each bucket, perhaps holding only a few gallons, would be filled, lifted, passed, and emptied, only for the empty bucket to be passed back down the line to be refilled. The flow was agonizingly slow, a trickle against a torrent. The heat from the blaze would be unbearable, searing your skin, blistering your face. Smoke would fill your lungs, burning your eyes, making it almost impossible to see or breathe. Yet, the chain would continue, a testament to sheer desperation and collective will. But even this Herculean effort often felt like trying to empty the sea with a teacup. The water would evaporate instantly on contact with the superheated timber, creating more steam, but barely diminishing the flames. The roar of the fire would mock your efforts, its hungry crackle growing louder with every passing moment. Beyond the buckets, what else did you have? Axes and fire hooks. These were not for dousing flames, but for a more brutal, desperate strategy: demolition. When a fire threatened to spread uncontrollably from one building to the next, the only recourse was to create a firebreak. You would see men and sometimes women wielding heavy axes, hacking at timber beams, tearing down walls, and ripping off thatched roofs. Imagine the agonizing decision. Destroy your neighbor's home or even your own in the hope of saving the rest of the street, the rest of the town. You would swing the axe with all your might, splinters flying, sweat pouring down your face, not to save a life directly but to create a void, a gap that the fire could not leap across. Fire hooks, long poles with sharp metal hooks at the end, were used to pull down burning timbers and walls from a safer distance, or at least a distance slightly less perilous. The air would be filled not just with the crackle of fire, but with the rending crash of collapsing structures, the shouts of warning, the frantic cries of those who watched their livelihoods being torn apart, piece by piece. Ladders, simple wooden constructions, were another essential but often inadequate tool. They were used to reach higher windows to gain access to roofs, or to help people escape from upper floors. But these ladders were rarely long enough, stable enough, or numerous enough to meet the demands of a rapidly spreading blaze. Imagine the terrifying ascent on a rickety ladder, smoke billowing around you, the heat from the inferno below threatening to engulf you at any moment, as you try to reach a trapped family or break a hole in a burning roof. Then there were the truly primitive fire engines of the day, hand squirts or syringes. These were large metal or wooden syringes, often operated by two people. One person would plunge the nozzle into a bucket of water, drawing the liquid up, while the other would pump a handle, forcing a weak stream of water in the general direction of the flames. Their range was minimal, their pressure almost non-existent. They were less like fire hoses and more like glorified water pistols, utterly dwarfed by the inferno they were meant to combat. Their use was often more symbolic than effective, offering a small, desperate gesture against an overwhelming force. Some communities also kept large, heavy blankets, often made of felt or thick wool, which could be soaked in water and used to smother small fires or protect nearby structures from sparks. Bags of sand or earth were also employed, hurled onto small outbreaks or used to create barriers. But these were measures for nascent fires or for containing embers, not for confronting a fully developed, raging inferno. The challenges were not merely about the tools or lack thereof. The very environment of the medieval town conspired against effective firefighting. Buildings were packed tightly together, often sharing walls, or separated only by narrow, winding alleys that were impassable to anything larger than a handcart. Construction was overwhelmingly timber-framed, with roofs typically thatched from straw or reeds, materials that were essentially kindling, designed to ignite and burn with terrifying speed. A single spark, carried by an errant gust of wind, could leap from one thatched roof to another, igniting an entirely new section of the town in moments. You would watch in horror as the fire seemed to dance and jump, defying all efforts to contain it. The wind, often your unseen enemy, would fan the flames, transforming a manageable blaze into an uncontrollable conflagration. The lack of coordination was another crippling factor. With no central command, no trained leaders, the efforts were often chaotic. Shouts of instructions, often contradictory, would compete with the roar of the fire and the cries of panic. People would work tirelessly, bravely, but often without a coherent strategy. There was no protective gear for these volunteer firefighters. You wore your normal clothes, your skin exposed to the intense heat, your lungs breathing in thick, toxic smoke. Burns, smoke inhalation, and even falling debris were constant dangers. Many who bravely fought the fires became casualties themselves. You might have heard the grim stories, perhaps even witnessed them firsthand. Entire districts reduced to smoking rubble within hours, a lifetime of possessions, homes, and businesses vanishing in a maelstrom of flame and ash. The despair was palpable, the sense of helplessness overwhelming. The very scale of the destruction often led to a profound resignation. Sometimes all you could do was stand back, watch, and pray that the wind would shift, or that the fire would somehow miraculously burn itself out before it reached your own door. The primitive tools, the inadequate water supply, the flammable architecture, the lack of organization, all combined to create a scenario where human effort, no matter how valiant, was often little more than a desperate gesture against an unstoppable force. It was an arsenal of futility, a collection of sticks and stones brought to a battle against a dragon. The memories of such a fire would be etched deep into the collective consciousness of a community, a stark reminder of humanity's fragility in the face of nature's raw power. You would carry the smell of smoke in your clothes for days, the sight of the glowing embers in your mind's eye for weeks, and the echo of the screams and shouts in your ears long after the last smoldering beam had cooled. The struggle against the raging inferno was not just a battle for property, it was a battle for survival, often lost, against an enemy that consumed all without mercy. It was a harrowing, terrifying ordeal that shaped the lives and the very architecture of medieval towns for centuries to come. You stand on a bustling street in a medieval European town. Imagine the sensory experience. The air is thick with the smells of wood smoke, baking bread, and unwashed bodies. You are surrounded by a symphony of sounds, the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones, the shouts of merchants, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But beyond these immediate sensations, there is an underlying truth about this world, a constant, palpable threat woven into the very fabric of its existence. This is a landscape built for speed, not for safety. This is a civilization erected on a foundation of kindling. Look around you. Every building, from the humblest hovel to the grandest guild hall, tells a story of immediate utility over long-term resilience. The predominant material is timber. Thick, sturdy beams form the skeletal framework of almost every structure. Between these timbers, you see wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches and twigs plastered with clay, mud, and straw. This infill offers little resistance to flame. Above your head, roofs are often thatched, layers upon layers of dried straw or reeds. Beautiful to look at, perhaps rustic and warm, but an invitation for disaster. It is a crown of dried grass, poised to ignite. Think about the density of these towns. Buildings huddle shoulder to shoulder, their upper stories often jettied, meaning they overhang the street, sometimes almost touching the buildings across the way. You can almost reach out and touch the house opposite yours from an upstairs window. This creates a suffocating canopy, a narrow canyon where any fire that begins on one side of the street can easily leap to the other. There are few open spaces, no wide boulevards to serve as fire breaks. The streets themselves are often winding, labyrinthine passages, too narrow for any effective firefighting equipment, even if such equipment existed beyond a bucket and a hook. The daily life of a medieval town also generates a continuous, omnipresent fire risk. Open flames are everywhere, an absolute necessity for survival and commerce. In your own home, a hearth provides warmth, a place to cook meals, a flickering light against the encroaching darkness. These are not enclosed, modern fireplaces with sophisticated flues. Often they are simply stone or brick-lined pits on the floor, or slightly raised structures with a rudimentary smoke hood, the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or simply permeating the living space. Sparks fly. Embers escape. Venture into the workshops. The baker's oven, a roaring inferno day and night, sends heat radiating into the surrounding timber walls. The blacksmith's forge glows red hot, showering sparks as he hammers metal into shape. Candle makers melt tallow over open flames. Tanners use fires to heat their solutions. Every craft, every household chore, every moment of daily existence involves a direct interaction with fire, often in close proximity to highly flammable materials. You cannot escape it. The very air you breathe sometimes carries the faint, acrid scent of char. Consider the simple act of lighting your way through the darkness. You rely on rushlights made from dried rushes soaked in animal fat, or on candles, both producing an open flame. If you are wealthy, you might have oil lamps. But a gust of wind, a clumsy movement, a sleeping hand knocking over a lamp, and the small, controlled flame instantly becomes an uncontrolled menace. There is no such thing as a fireproof safe in this era, no circuit breaker, no sprinkler system. Only vigilance and often not enough of it. The cumulative effect of this construction and lifestyle is a kind of architectural precarity. Each town is a vast, intricate, beautiful, and utterly terrifying tinderbox. The timber frames, once seasoned and dry, become the perfect fuel. The thatched roofs, like giant, inviting torches, are ready to catch the first errant spark. The wattle and daub, brittle and dry, offers little more than a momentary barrier before collapsing into flaming debris. Pitch and tar, used to waterproof roofs or seal cracks, burn with an intense, furious heat, accelerating the inferno. You feel this fragility in your bones. Every strong gust of wind makes you glance nervously at the smoke rising from your chimney. Every distant alarm bell sends a shiver down your spine. You know, intellectually and from bitter experience, that one small spark, one moment of carelessness, can unravel the entire fabric of your community. The fire is not an external threat. It is an intrinsic part of the environment, always lurking, always hungry. This constant threat dictated much of urban planning or the lack thereof in an ironic twist. Towns grew organically, haphazardly, driven by necessity and expansion. There was little thought given to fire zoning or creating strategic fire breaks. When fires inevitably erupted, the very density that allowed for bustling markets and close-knit communities became a death trap. The narrow streets, which facilitated social interaction and defensive positions against human enemies, became conduits for flames, funneling oxygen and embers from one building to the next. Imagine the wind on a dry summer day. A small fire starts in a bakery, perhaps from an overheated oven or a stray ember. Within minutes, the thatched roof is ablaze. The dry timber frame catches. The heat intensifies, cracking the wattle and daub. Smoke billows, then flames. The wind, now a conspirator, whips the burning debris into the air. Fiery brands, like deadly meteors, fly across the narrow street, landing on the dry straw roof of the house opposite. That house ignites. Then the next. And the next. You are not merely witnessing a building burn. You are watching a chain reaction, an uncontrolled chemical process devouring everything in its path. The air becomes superheated, creating its own violent updrafts and whirlwinds of flame. The roar is deafening, a monstrous sound of crackling wood, shattering glass, and collapsing structures. The heat is unbearable, forcing you back, even as you desperately try to save your possessions, your home, your neighbor's life. The lack of effective building codes or widespread fire prevention measures meant that towns were built with an almost suicidal disregard for the risks. Until much later periods, there were no widespread requirements for stone or tile roofs, no mandatory distances between buildings, no fire-resistant materials in common use. Building traditions emphasized speed, affordability, and the use of readily available local materials, all of which were highly combustible. This was not due to ignorance of fire, but perhaps a fatalistic acceptance, coupled with the economic realities and technological limitations of the age. Think of the sheer amount of fuel concentrated in a medieval town. Not just the houses themselves but the contents within. Wooden furniture, straw mattresses, dried foodstuffs, textiles, barrels of ale and wine, oils for lamps. Each home was a meticulously arranged collection of highly flammable items, waiting for a spark. The shops and workshops were even worse. Storage of raw materials like wool, flax, timber, and fuels like charcoal and pitch added exponentially to the fire load. The constant threat of fire had a profound psychological impact on the inhabitants. It was a shared anxiety and ever-present shadow. Every citizen, from the lord to the lowliest peasant, understood the precariousness of their existence. This understanding fostered a sense of community preparedness, albeit a rudimentary one. Buckets of water were kept ready. Ladders were a common sight. But these were individual efforts, often overwhelmed by the scale of the threat. The medieval town, with its charming timber-framed houses and bustling markets, was a testament to human ingenuity and communal living. Yet, beneath this vibrant facade lay an inherent vulnerability, a structural flaw that made it a constant candidate for catastrophic destruction. The beauty of these towns was inextricably linked to their danger. You lived in a world where your daily existence was a precarious dance with the elemental force of fire, a dance that often ended in tragedy. The European landscape, dotted with these timber and thatch settlements, was a vast network of potential infernos, waiting for the right conditions to explode into devastating life. This intrinsic flammability also explains why many medieval towns, especially in Northern Europe, suffered not just one but multiple devastating fires over their centuries of existence. They would burn, be rebuilt, often using the same highly combustible materials, and then burn again. It was a cyclical pattern of destruction and rebirth, each time leaving its indelible mark on the landscape and the memory of its inhabitants. You would literally be rebuilding on ashes, hoping for a different outcome, but often falling victim to the same fundamental design flaws. The very foundations of your world were, quite literally, designed to burn. If the very foundations of your world were designed to burn, then the individuals who dared to stand against that inferno were condemning themselves to a gauntlet of unimaginable physical and mental suffering. You are not merely witnessing a fire, you are actively confronting it, placing your own body in the path of its destructive fury. For the earliest firefighters, the concept of workplace safety was non-existent. Their protection amounted to little more than the clothes on their backs, often woolen or leather, which would quickly become saturated with water, heavy, and still offered scant defense against the intense heat and flying embers. Imagine yourself in the thick of it. The roar of the flames is deafening, a hungry beast devouring timber and thatch. You are surrounded by a maelstrom of heat, smoke, and chaos. Your hands, bare or perhaps covered in simple leather gloves, are the first point of contact with this brutal reality. They guide the primitive hooks and axes, they grasp the heavy buckets, they strain against the ropes pulling down burning walls. It is these hands that bear the immediate brunt of the inferno's fury. Burns were, of course, an ever-present danger, from the agonizing sizzle of superheated air against exposed skin to the searing touch of molten tar or flaming debris. You might pull back a hand, momentarily stunned by the pain, only to realize the skin has blistered instantly, a white-hot agony that promises days, weeks, or even months of torment. But the dangers extended far beyond the obvious scorch marks. Think about the environment itself. The air you breathed was not air at all, but a thick, choking mixture of smoke, ash, and combustion byproducts. Every ragged breath you take drags acrid soot deep into your lungs. You cough, your throat sears, and your eyes stream with tears, blurring your vision in an already disorienting scene. The cumulative effect of this smoke inhalation was insidious. It damaged your respiratory system, leaving you gasping for air, weakening your capacity for strenuous effort, and setting the stage for long-term health complications like chronic bronchitis or even early death. It was a silent killer, slowly suffocating you from the inside out, long after the visible flames had been doused. Then there was the constant threat of falling debris. The structures you were trying to save, or sometimes deliberately demolishing to create fire breaks, were unstable. A massive timber beam, weakened by fire, could suddenly give way, crashing down with bone-shattering force. A stone wall, heated to its breaking point, might explode outwards, sending jagged fragments flying like shrapnel. You operate under a constant rain of sparks, embers, and collapsing materials. A heavy roof tile could strike your head, even through a rudimentary helmet if you were fortunate enough to possess one, causing concussions or worse. Splinters of flaming wood could embed themselves in your skin, turning a minor cut into a festering, infected wound. You would move with a heightened sense of alert, your ears straining for the telltale groans and creaks of failing architecture, knowing that at any moment, your world could literally collapse on top of you. Consider the sheer physical toll. Fighting a fire in this era was an incredibly strenuous activity, demanding immense strength and endurance. You would be carrying heavy leather buckets, often weighing dozens of pounds when full of water, rushing them from a nearby well or river. You would wield heavy axes to chop through doors or create vents. You would pull on long hooks with all your might, attempting to drag down burning sections of a building. Your muscles would ache, your limbs would burn with fatigue, and your heart would pound relentlessly in your chest. The risk of overexertion, heatstroke, or cardiac arrest was very real. You could stumble on uneven ground, twisted by fire, spraining an ankle or tearing a ligament. A misstep on a slippery, water-soaked surface could send you sprawling, potentially into dangerous debris or even a hidden pit. Broken bones were not uncommon from falls, impacts, or the crushing weight of falling objects. And your own tools, designed to combat the fire, could become instruments of injury. The heavy, unrefined metal tools, axes, pikes, long-handled hooks, were difficult to wield precisely in the chaotic conditions. A misplaced swing could strike a fellow firefighter or yourself. The primitive hand pumps, requiring immense cooperative effort, could pinch or crush fingers if operated carelessly in the frantic pace of the emergency. Imagine a splinter from a wooden handle embedding itself deep in your palm, or a heavy metal head striking your leg in the confusion. These were not precision instruments. They were blunt forces designed for brute work, and they carried their own inherent risks. The very element you sought to control, water, also posed its own dangers. While essential, water could create treacherous conditions. Floors became slick and treacherous, making footing precarious. Standing water could hide unseen hazards, like sharp debris or structural weaknesses. In some instances, firefighters would even fall into wells or cisterns while attempting to draw water, their heavy, water-soaked clothing dragging them down to a watery grave. The combination of intense heat and sudden drenching could also lead to extreme temperature fluctuations, especially during colder months. Fighting a fire in winter meant battling the flames while simultaneously contending with freezing water, which could lead to hypothermia once the initial heat of the fire dissipated. Your fingers would become numb, your movements sluggish, and your body temperature would plummet, adding another layer of silent, creeping danger. The injuries sustained in these infernos were not just immediate and acute, they often had devastating long-term consequences. A severe burn, even if it did not prove fatal, could lead to permanent disfigurement, limiting mobility and causing chronic pain. The scarring could be extensive, tightening skin over joints, making simple movements excruciating. Lungs damaged by smoke inhalation could never fully recover, condemning you to a life of wheezing, coughing, and shortness of breath, making any physical labor increasingly difficult. Eye injuries from flying embers or intense heat could lead to partial or complete blindness. Hearing could be permanently damaged by the constant roar of the flames and the percussive crashes of collapsing structures. And then there was the almost complete lack of effective medical treatment. A severe burn in a medieval or early modern context was a death sentence or, at best, a gateway to prolonged agony and infection. Without antiseptics, antibiotics, or a deep understanding of wound care, even minor burns could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene, sepsis, and a slow, agonizing death. Broken bones might be set poorly, if at all, resulting in permanent deformities and chronic pain. Internal injuries, like those from smoke inhalation or blunt force trauma, were largely untreatable and often misunderstood. You would return from an inferno, your body broken and scarred, to a world where your injuries were treated with poultices, prayers, and often, little more than resignation. The concept of specialized burn units or rehabilitative therapy was centuries away. The scorched hand of duty, then, is far more than a poetic phrase. It is a literal testament to the suffering endured. It speaks of the blisters and the missing fingers, the blackened skin and the raw flesh. But it also speaks to the invisible wounds, the lungs choked with ash, the ears ringing from the roar, the eyes clouded by smoke, and the mind forever scarred by the terrifying beauty and destructive power of the inferno. You were not just fighting a fire, you were sacrificing pieces of yourself, limb by limb, breath by breath, in a desperate attempt to protect your community from utter annihilation. Your very existence was a testament to courage, resilience, and an almost unthinkable tolerance for pain. Every joint ached, every breath was a reminder, every scar a story etched onto your very being. These early firefighters truly walked through fire, and carried the indelible marks of that journey for the rest of their often shortened lives. You carried the scars of fire, visible and brutal, upon your skin. But there was another enemy, an insidious attacker, one that you welcomed into the very core of your being with every desperate gasp for air. This was the breath of smoke, the invisible killer that coiled within every blaze, silently, relentlessly, destroying you from the inside out. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the inferno, the heat a palpable force pushing against your exposed skin, your eyes straining to peer through the gloom. You brace yourself, drawing in a ragged breath, and immediately, your lungs protest with a violent spasm. It is not just the sudden sting of ash or the acrid taste of burning wood, although those are present, sharp and undeniable. It is a far more complex assault, a toxic cocktail brewed in the heart of destruction. The air around you is thick, a swirling, opaque curtain that chokes the light and steals your vision, reducing the world to an indistinguishable gray void. Each inhalation pulls in not just air, but a dense, suffocating mix of carbon particles, superheated gases, and deadly chemical compounds released from whatever the fire consumed. Think for a moment of the structures you faced. Not just timber and thatch, though even that produces its own fierce toxins, but homes filled with textiles dyed with lead and arsenic, workshops burning with tallow and pitch, distilleries exploding with potent spirits, or entire city blocks consuming human and animal waste, coal dust from hearths, and 1,000 other unknown substances that festered in the urban landscape. Every fire was a unique, uncontrolled chemical experiment, its smoke a bespoke poison designed to incapacitate and kill. You had no way of knowing what exact combination of toxins you were inhaling. All you knew was the immediate, searing, burning sensation that screamed through your airways. As you moved deeper into the smoke, the air grew hotter, heavier, feeling like a physical weight pressing down on your chest. Your throat constricted, raw and burning, a constant irritation that made swallowing difficult. Your eyes streamed tears, blurring your already limited visibility, turning the chaotic scene into a watery, indistinguishable mess. The coughing started, a deep, racking spasm that tore at your chest, making it impossible to take a full, cleansing breath, to shout a warning to a comrade, or to even clear your lungs. You could feel the particulates, tiny, sharp shards of ash and soot, scratching at your windpipe, embedding themselves in the delicate tissues of your lungs with every desperate gulp for air. This was not merely an inconvenience. It was the direct injection of a potent, slow-acting poison into your bloodstream and respiratory system. One of the most dangerous components of this invisible enemy was carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless gas that you could never detect until its insidious effects began to claim you. As it flooded your system, subtly replacing the oxygen in your blood, you would feel a creeping fatigue, a dull ache in your temples, then a pounding headache that throbbed with every heartbeat. Your limbs might grow heavy, your muscles refusing to obey, and your mind would become hazy and confused, struggling to process even the simplest thoughts. Disorientation would set in, making simple tasks like holding an axe steady or dragging a heavy hose pipe feel utterly insurmountable. Your judgment, so critical in the chaos of a fire, would begin to falter, leading to potentially fatal mistakes. You might stumble, fall, and find it impossible to rise, succumbing not to the direct kiss of the flames, but to the silent, suffocating embrace of the gas, fading into an eternal sleep. Many firefighters in those early days simply vanished into the smoke, their bodies discovered later, untouched by fire but robbed of life by its unseen exhales. Even if you escaped the immediate, acute dangers of smoke inhalation and walked away from the burning structure, the long-term consequences were a life sentence. Every fire you fought, Every choking cloud of smoke you breathed left an indelible internal mark. Your lungs, once robust and efficient, became scarred and compromised, their capacity slowly diminishing. The constant irritation and inflammation from repeated exposure would lead to chronic bronchitis, a persistent rattling cough that punctuated your days and nights, a grim soundtrack to your life. You would find yourself perpetually short of breath, even at rest, a wheezing testament to the irreparable damage inflicted by years of exposure. Tasks that were once simple, like climbing a flight of stairs, carrying a heavy bucket of water, or even walking swiftly, would become Herculean efforts, leaving you gasping for air, your chest burning with a familiar, internal fire that refused to be extinguished. Imagine the daily struggle, waking each morning with a chest so tight it felt encased in iron, coughing up thick, black phlegm that bore the undeniable, dark evidence of the previous day's inferno. Your breathing would be shallow, your energy levels constantly depleted, leaving you perpetually exhausted. You were not just fighting a fire, you were fighting for every single breath, long after the visible flames had been extinguished and the embers cooled. The relentless exposure to various toxins, from lead in paints to arsenic in dyes, from heavy metals in industrial fires to biological contaminants, would also take its cumulative toll, contributing to a weakened immune system, persistent infections, and an overall, steady decline in your physical health. There was no protection against this pervasive enemy. No specialized breathing apparatus, no filtered masks to safeguard your precious lungs. At best, you might have instinctively pulled a wet cloth over your mouth and nose, a futile, almost symbolic gesture against the microscopic onslaught of particulate matter and toxic gases. You relied solely on your natural resilience, an almost inhuman capacity for endurance, and a grim determination to push through the agony, knowing deep down that each breath you took brought you closer to illness, closer to an early grave. The roaring inferno was a visible, immediate, terrifying threat, but the smoke, creeping into every crevice of your body, was the more insidious killer, slowly strangling your vitality, silently stealing your future. This constant battle against the invisible adversary explains why so many early firefighters had drastically shortened lifespans. They might survive countless blazes, endure horrifying burns, and escape the crushing collapse of buildings, only to succumb years later to a quiet, internal suffering that baffled their families and doctors. Their deaths were often vaguely attributed to consumption, decline, or weakness of the lungs, vague diagnoses that masked the true brutal culprit. A lifetime of inhaling the poisons of burning Europe, a continent constantly reshaping itself through fire. The roar of the flames, the crackle of burning timber, the shouts of your comrades, the desperate pleas of those you sought to save, these were the immediate, undeniable sounds of your daily struggle. But beneath it all, there was the silent suffocation, the slow poisoning that accompanied every single breath you took within that dense, choking cloud. The fire might spare your life in the immediate moment, but the smoke ensured that it would chip away at it, piece by piece, breath by breath, until there was nothing left to give. It was a harrowing trade-off. You gave your life and health to save others' homes, livelihoods, and futures, and in return the fire claimed your lungs, your health, and ultimately your precious years. The very air you breathed, meant to sustain you, became the very medium through which your demise was slowly, irrevocably delivered. You lived with the constant, burning memory of the fire, not just in your mind, but etched into the very fabric of your being, in every struggle for breath. The true cost of your courage for you was measured not just in skin and bone, not just in exhaustion and pain, but in the precious, poisoned air that irrevocably filled your lungs. It was a debt paid with every inhalation. You have just navigated the suffocating grasp of the smoke, your lungs burning, your body aching. But the fire rages on, a hungry beast devouring timber and stone, and for all its fury, you know one simple devastating truth: it needs water. And water, in this era, is a luxury, an elusive treasure, a logistical nightmare that weighs heavier on your shoulders than any bucket you might carry. Imagine standing before a roaring inferno, its heat searing your face, the sound of crackling wood a relentless drumbeat in your ears. You clutch your axe or perhaps a rudimentary hook, ready to tear down structures and starve the beast, because the one thing that could truly douse its rage is nowhere to be found, not in the quantities you desperately need. This is not the modern world, where hydrants gleam on every corner, promising an endless torrent. Here, the challenge of water acquisition is a war unto itself, often lost before the first drop even reaches the blaze. Where do you turn? Your eyes scan the chaotic street, searching, hoping. Rivers or canals might crisscross your city, a vein of life through its stone arteries. But these vital waterways are rarely convenient. They might be blocks away or worse, separated by a labyrinth of narrow alleys and tightly packed buildings, making direct access for anything larger than a man with a bucket utterly impossible. Even if you reach them, the banks are often steep, muddy, or crowded with other desperate souls, all vying for that same precious liquid. Consider the journey. You are not simply turning a valve. You are orchestrating a human chain, a desperate, sweating relay. Picture it now, a line of men, sometimes women and children too, stretching from the nearest available water source, perhaps a public pump or a communal well, all the way to the inferno. Hand to hand, bucket to bucket, the water is passed along. Each bucket is heavy, perhaps made of leather or crude wood, and by the time it reaches the front lines, a good portion has already sloshed out, spilled in the hurry and the chaos. The ground beneath your feet becomes a muddy, treacherous mess, making every step a struggle. These buckets themselves are a testament to the era's limitations. Leather, while relatively lighter than metal, quickly degrades with repeated use, becoming stiff, prone to cracking and leaking more water than it holds. They are not uniform. Some are larger, some smaller, making the rhythm of the brigade inconsistent, prone to bottlenecks and stoppages. Each empty bucket must then be sent back down the line, an additional stream of traffic adding to the confusion, the urgency, and the fatigue. And what about those water sources? A public pump offers a trickle, not a gush. You might stand there, pumping furiously, drawing water from the depths, each stroke a strain on your muscles. The flow is slow, agonizingly so, as the fire laughs at your efforts, growing exponentially faster than you can possibly supply its counter. A single pump can barely keep up with the demands of a small fire, let alone a conflagration threatening an entire neighborhood. Private wells present their own set of obstacles. They are often on private property, guarded by locked gates or suspicious owners. Time is not on your side for negotiations, but trespass can lead to further conflict when all you seek is to save the very community. Even if you gain access, these wells are designed for domestic use, for a single household's needs, not for the insatiable thirst of a building engulfed in flames. They are quickly depleted, leaving you dry and desperate, forced to abandon that source and begin the frantic search anew. Rainwater cisterns, a common feature in many homes, collect precious rainfall. But these too are private, often small, and entirely dependent on the recent weather. A dry spell means empty cisterns. A freezing winter means solid blocks of ice, requiring laborious and time-consuming efforts to break and melt, time you absolutely do not have when flames are licking at the sky. The logistics become even more complex in the narrow, winding streets of old European cities. You see them every day, these ancient arteries of stone and cobblestone, charming in their antiquity, but a death trap during a fire. A fire engine, even the rudimentary hand-pumped vehicles of the time, struggles to navigate these tight passages. They are designed for width, for turning space, not for the twisting paths that grew organically over centuries. Carts, wagons, even simple barrels hauled by horses, often get stuck, blocking the already congested streets, creating a bottleneck that brings the entire water delivery system to a grinding halt. Imagine the frustration. You are a firefighter, courageous, driven by a powerful sense of duty. You have trained, you have suffered, you have faced the smoke and the heat. But your greatest adversary is not the fire itself, nor even the falling debris, but the sheer, unforgiving geography of your city and the primitive technology at your disposal. You are fighting a fire with essentially a glorified garden hose, or rather, a series of tiny watering cans passed down a line, against a monster demanding a veritable river. This scarcity of water fundamentally altered firefighting strategy. Instead of direct attack and suppression, your efforts are often shifted towards containment and destruction. You pull down adjacent buildings, creating fire breaks not because you want to, but because you must. It is a grim calculus. Sacrifice a few homes, tear them down with axes and hooks to save the rest, because you simply cannot get enough water to stop the initial blaze. This demolition work is arduous, dangerous, and heartbreaking, as you destroy property that might have been saved if only water were abundant. The winter months compound this already dire situation. Freezing temperatures turn exposed water sources into solid ice. Rivers and canals become impassable. Pumps freeze solid, their mechanisms locked in icy rigidity. Even the precious water you manage to gather can quickly freeze in buckets or in the rudimentary hoses, rendering it useless. You are battling not only fire but also the relentless, unforgiving elements, turning a desperate situation into an almost hopeless one. You might see early attempts at creating dedicated water reservoirs for firefighting, large cisterns built beneath public squares or street intersections, designed to be filled from wells or rainwater. These are glimmers of foresight, but they are few and far between, often insufficient in capacity, and still rely on manual drawing and transportation. They offer temporary relief, a small oasis in a desert of need, but they are not the systemic solution required to truly combat widespread urban fires. The hand-pumped fire engines, a marvel of their time, were impressive machines. But their effectiveness was severely limited by their water supply. They could spray a powerful jet, but only for as long as buckets were being continuously poured into their reservoirs. The pump was only as good as the brigade feeding it, and that brigade was often exhausted, demoralized, and struggling against the very physics of limited resources. The image of these machines, capable of so much, yet starved of their essential fuel, perfectly encapsulates the logistical nightmare. The constant struggle for water defined your reality as an early firefighter. It was a race against time, not just to reach the fire, but to find, gather, and transport enough water to make a difference. The exhaustion in your limbs, the burning in your lungs from the smoke, was compounded by the endless trek for water, the heavy lifting, the desperate calls for more. You would often return from a call not just with the stench of smoke clinging to your clothes, and the ache of exertion in your bones, but with a profound sense of frustration. The knowledge that lives and livelihoods were lost, not always due to a lack of courage or effort on your part, but simply because the very lifeblood of your profession, water, remained an elusive, precious, and tragically scarce commodity. This was the silent, unseen battle fought at every single fire, a battle against infrastructure, against geography, and against the sheer, overwhelming odds of a thirsty inferno. You learned quickly that in this desperate fight, water was not just a tool, it was the ultimate, deciding factor, and its absence was often the true victor. The absence of water was indeed a silent, ultimate victor, often dooming your efforts before they truly began. But once a blaze truly took hold, you faced a far more immediate and visceral set of adversaries, ones that clawed at your courage and threatened your very survival in the most terrifying ways imaginable. Beyond the scorching heat and choking smoke, beyond the relentless, exhausting labor, lay the insidious, omnipresent threat of the world around you simply giving way. This world, the medieval or early modern European city, was a labyrinth built for speed of construction and density, not for resilience against fire. You look around even in moments of relative calm, and see narrow, winding streets where upper stories often jutted out, practically touching their counterparts across the way. Timber frames, plaster and lath, thatched roofs, all tightly packed together like kindling awaiting a spark. And when that spark came, often from an overturned candle, a runaway cooking fire, or a blacksmith's forge. The result was catastrophic. The first sign often was not the smell of smoke but the sound. A sudden, piercing shriek from a woman, a man's guttural shout of alarm, quickly joined by a cacophony of voices rising in volume and urgency. You would hear it spreading like a ripple across the cobblestones, moving faster than any flame. Panic. It was a disease that infected the very air, transforming neighbors into desperate individuals, focused solely on self-preservation or the futile rescue of cherished possessions. Families, shopkeepers, apprentices, servants, all became a frantic, terrified mob. You watch as people, driven by terror, stream out of their homes, often carrying unwieldy bundles of clothes, tools, or even furniture. They block the very paths you needed clear for your crew and your precious water buckets. They stumble, they fall, they cry out for lost children or trapped family members. The narrow streets, already congested with the ordinary bustle of city life, became utterly impassable. Hysterical pleas turn into desperate shoves, fear giving way to irrational aggression. You yell commands, try to direct the surging human torrent, but your voice is swallowed by the din, your authority dissolving in the face of widespread terror. Every second spent trying to navigate this human crush was a second lost to the advancing fire, a second for the flames to consume another home, another life. This was not an organized evacuation. It was a desperate, every person for themselves scramble for survival. And then, above the clamor of human fear and the roaring inferno, came the truly terrifying sounds. The deep groan of stressed timbers, the sharp crack of breaking wood, the ominous rumble of masonry loosening its grip. These were the death knells of buildings, the horrifying symphony of destruction. You knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that settled deep in your stomach, that a structure was not simply burning, it was failing. Its very integrity was giving way. You could feel the ground tremble beneath your feet as sections of wall, weakened by intense, relentless heat, began to sag. Smoke, thick and black, would suddenly billow from an upper window, not just from the fire within, but from the actual substance of the building itself, burning from the inside out, consuming its very structure. Then came the first pieces of falling debris, a dislodged roof tile clattering to the street with an unnerving sound, a shower of burning embers, a small chunk of plaster. These were just warnings, precursors to the true disaster. The true danger arrived with the sound of a structure beginning its final, catastrophic descent. A deep, resonant creak, like a giant sigh of resignation, followed by a series of explosive reports as supporting beams, scorched and charred, finally gave way. You had mere seconds, sometimes less, to react. A wall could suddenly buckle outwards, sending a terrifying cascade of stones, timber, and burning thatch into the street where you stood, or into an adjacent alley. An entire roof might collapse inwards with a deafening, thunderous crash, sucking air and flames into the void it created, then sending a fiery plume of sparks and smoke high into the sky, a beacon of devastation. You learn, through bitter experience, to read the buildings. The way the smoke curls and pulses, the specific kind of crackle and hiss from the burning materials, the subtle shift in the angle of a distant roofline that tells you a beam has snapped. But even with years of experience, the element of surprise was a constant, deadly companion. One moment you might be dousing a lower floor, focused on containing the immediate flames, the next, the entire upper story could come crashing down, creating an instant inferno of newly exposed, superheated material, or far, far worse, burying your comrades beneath tons of burning rubble, their desperate cries silenced by the crushing weight. The heat was not just from the flames immediately before you. It radiated with an unseen, intense energy from every burning surface, weakening the very bricks and stones of adjacent buildings. Picture it. A stone wall, solid for centuries, begins to groan, its mortar slowly crumbling into dust, its ancient beams buckling and twisting, simply from the radiant heat of a neighboring inferno. This meant that even when you thought you had contained one fire, the potential for another collapse, another immediate threat, was always present, lurking just out of sight, or just around the corner, ready to unleash its own cascade of destruction. You understand that the structure you are dousing, the one whose flames you are battling, is itself a ticking clock. The internal integrity is compromised. Beams char, crack, and snap with an audible report that resonates through your very bones. Floors become soft, treacherous traps that could give way beneath your weight at any moment, sending you tumbling into a fiery abyss below. Roofs, often heavy with slate or tile, become giant, unstable plates waiting to crash down, perhaps on you, perhaps on those attempting to flee below. Imagine standing in a narrow alleyway, battling a blaze in a timber-framed building. The heat is unbearable, making your skin feel like it is baking. You glance up, and through the swirling smoke, you see a crack, a spiderweb of fracture, appear in the plaster of the wall above you. A shiver runs down your spine despite the heat. You hear a series of sharp, violent pops like cannon fire as joists give way. Then, the sickening sound of wood tearing, as if a giant hand is ripping apart a tree. You instinctively duck and cover, pressing yourself against the less affected wall, praying that the deluge of burning debris will not find you, will not crush you. These collapsing structures did more than just threaten your life. They devoured vital access routes without warning. A street you had just traversed, filled moments ago with fleeing people and struggling comrades, could suddenly be choked and blocked by a newly fallen timber or a completely collapsed facade. This instantly trapped those behind it, cutting off their escape and preventing desperately needed reinforcements from reaching you and your team. Your carefully planned routes for water lines, for escape, for movement, became as volatile and unpredictable as the flames themselves. One moment, a clear path; the next, an insurmountable wall of burning rubble. The psychological toll of this constant, unseen enemy was immense. You were fighting not only the visible roaring fire, but the very architecture of the city, the inherent weaknesses of its materials, and the relentless, unforgiving physics of destruction. Every time you stepped into a burning building, every time you approached a structure showing the telltale signs of imminent collapse, you were gambling with your life, your body, your very existence, against forces that were utterly indifferent to your courage or your cause. The sheer unpredictability of it all, the knowledge that at any moment the ground beneath you or the ceiling above you could give way, was a profound and constant psychological torment. It was a terror that seeped into your bones, a chilling counterpoint to the scorching heat, reminding you that in this desperate fight, victory often meant simply surviving the next unexpected moment of catastrophe, and living to fight another day or perhaps for another hour. You might have survived the inferno, your body aching, your lungs burning, your mind still reeling from the chaos. You might have walked away from a collapsing wall or a flashover, a moment of sheer luck shielding you from instant death. But the fight for Europe's early firefighters was far from over when the last ember cooled and the last plume of smoke faded into the soot-stained sky. The immediate, dramatic threat of the flames was only one part of a far larger, more insidious war waged against your very constitution. For you, the silent partner in every blaze, the invisible adversary that stalked your every waking and sleeping moment, was disease. Imagine yourself standing amidst the smoldering ruins. The air is thick with the acrid stench of burnt timber, singed fabric, and something else, a heavy, cloying odor of damp ash and decaying refuse. Smoke, even hours or days after a fire is contained, continues to hang low, seeping into your clothing, your hair, your very skin. You breathe it in deep into your lungs day after day, year after year. This is not the clean smoke of a wood fire in a hearth. This is the toxic cocktail of burning pitch, tar, paints, varnishes, animal hides, and human waste, all coalescing into a corrosive fog. You feel the constant tickle in your throat, the persistent cough that racks your body, the tightening in your chest that never seems to fully release. Your lungs, perpetually irritated, become a fertile ground for infection. Bronchitis is a common companion, a rasping, painful affliction that makes every breath a shallow struggle. Pneumonia, a far more deadly foe, lurks in the background, ready to seize a body weakened by exhaustion and chronic irritation. You see your comrades, strong men, brought low by a fever and a cough that rapidly descends into a struggle for air, their faces turning blue, their lives extinguished not by flame, but by an unseen enemy that feasts on their damaged respiratory systems. Beyond the immediate damage to your lungs, consider the burns. Even the most careful firefighter, wearing rudimentary protective gear, is susceptible to searing heat. Sparks fly, molten materials drip, and a sudden flare-up can scorch exposed skin in an instant. You might suffer a blistered hand, a patch of seared skin on your arm, or even more severe, debilitating burns. In an era before antiseptics, before a rudimentary understanding of germ theory, any break in the skin was an open invitation to infection. A seemingly minor burn, if not properly cleaned and protected, and what constituted proper cleaning in a smoke-filled, unsanitary environment, could fester. The wound would turn red, then angry, then begin to ooze pus. Fevers would follow, a sign that the body was fighting a losing battle against invading bacteria. Sepsis, a systemic infection, was a common and terrifying consequence, turning a local injury into a deadly, full-body assault. You would watch men succumb to what today might be considered a treatable injury, their bodies racked with fever, their minds delirious, their lives slowly drained away by a bacterial invasion. And then there is the sheer physical toll. Fighting fires is an act of brutal exertion. You are dragging heavy hoses, lifting massive timbers, chopping through debris, often for 12, 18, 24 hours straight or even longer. You are drenched in sweat, then often soaked by water or rain, then exposed to the biting cold of the night air. Your muscles scream, your joints ache, and your entire body is pushed past its limits of endurance. This chronic exhaustion is a critical factor in your vulnerability to disease. Your immune system, constantly on high alert or more likely, completely depleted, struggles to fend off even the most common pathogens. Colds quickly morph into chest infections. A scratch on your arm becomes a raging cellulitis. Your weakened state makes you a prime target for every ailment circulating through the densely packed, often unsanitary cities of Europe. The very environment of firefighting further exacerbates the problem. You are often working in conditions of profound filth. The fires themselves expose underlying layers of accumulated grime, sewage, and waste. As you clear debris, you are often wading through stagnant water, mud, and the putrid remnants of whatever the fire consumed. Dead animals, spoiled food, human waste, all become churned into a noxious slurry. Your hands, inevitably covered in grime, might touch your face, your mouth, transferring countless bacteria and viruses. Drinking water, often drawn from potentially contaminated sources near the fire or carried in open buckets, poses another risk. Dysentery, a violent and dehydrating intestinal infection, is a constant threat. Cholera, when it sweeps through a city, finds fertile ground among a population already weakened and exposed to contaminated water sources. You might find yourself incapacitated by bouts of intense vomiting and diarrhea, your body rapidly losing vital fluids, your strength evaporating with every spasm. Consider the cuts and scrapes that are an inevitable part of the job. A splinter from a charred beam, a jagged edge of broken glass, a slip on debris, each creates an opening in your skin. These minor injuries, easily dismissed in the heat of the moment, can become entry points for the tetanus bacterium, lurking in the soil and debris of urban environments. A painful stiffness in your jaw, difficulty swallowing, then violent muscle spasms throughout your body, leading to an agonizing death. This is the horrifying progression of tetanus, a disease you are constantly exposed to through the nature of your work. Beyond the specific hazards of firefighting, you are also living in an era where infectious diseases are endemic. Typhus, spread by lice that thrive in crowded and unhygienic conditions, could rip through entire communities, including the fire brigades living and working in close quarters. Smallpox, a devastating viral disease, leaves its survivors scarred and often blind, or simply carries them off in a wave of fever and pox. The bubonic plague, though less frequent in later centuries, still resurfaced in terrifying outbreaks, striking fear into the hearts of everyone. You are a part of a community that lives cheek by jowl with these silent killers, and your profession, with its physical demands and constant exposure to the elements and unsanitary conditions, only amplifies your risk. The living conditions of early firefighters themselves were often dire. Many lived in barracks, sharing cramped spaces, contributing to the rapid spread of airborne illnesses. Food was often meager and lacking in essential nutrients, further weakening your body's defenses. A diet heavy in starches and lacking in fresh produce made you susceptible to scurvy, a debilitating disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, leading to bleeding gums, bruising, and profound fatigue, making you even more vulnerable to other infections. Even if you survive a major fire and avoid immediate infection, the cumulative toll on your body is immense. The repeated exposure to smoke and fumes leads to chronic respiratory issues that persist for the rest of your life. The constant physical strain takes its toll on your heart and joints, leading to premature aging and disability. The relentless cycle of exertion, exposure, and inadequate rest grinds down your resilience, making you a prime candidate for any disease that passes through the city. The sorrow extends beyond your own suffering. You are a vector, inadvertently bringing these ailments home to your family. A cough you dismiss as a lingering cold might be the precursor to a more serious illness that you pass to your wife or children. A fever you attribute to exhaustion could be a contagious disease that sweeps through your household, inflicting suffering on those you cherish most. The invisible hand of disease reaches out from the fiery chaos and into the presumed safety of your home. In this context, the limited medical knowledge and resources of the time are a stark reminder of your vulnerability. There are no antibiotics to fight bacterial infections, no vaccines for many common diseases. Doctors, where available, often rely on rudimentary practices, from bloodletting to herbal remedies, with varying degrees of efficacy and often doing more harm than good. Pain relief is crude, and the concept of sterile technique is centuries away. A simple wound, a persistent cough, a sudden fever, any of these could be a death sentence, not because of the fire itself but because your body, battered and exposed, had become a battleground for a different kind of war, one where the enemy was microscopic, relentless, and almost always victorious. You learn to live with a persistent dread, understanding that even if you outran the flames, the creeping shadow of illness was always there, waiting for its moment to claim you. It was a silent partner in your dangerous profession, a constant, unseen threat that often delivered the final, fatal blow long after the roar of the fire had faded to a memory. You live with the constant, unseen threat of illness, a silent partner in your dangerous profession that delivers its fatal blow long after the roar of the fire fades to a memory. But beyond the physical perils and the microscopic enemies that stalk you, another, more insidious adversary awaits. It is not fire nor disease, but the cold, hard gaze of the society you are sworn to protect. For you, the early firefighter, heroism is often a fleeting concept, quickly overshadowed by a pervasive social stigma, a thankless role that places you on the lowest rung of the societal ladder. Imagine yourself walking through the winding, narrow streets of your city after a particularly brutal blaze. Your clothes are singed, caked with soot and ash. The acrid smell of smoke clings to your skin and hair, a constant reminder of the inferno you just battled. Your hands are raw, blistered, perhaps bandaged from a rope burn or a shard of falling timber. Your face is grimy, streaked with sweat and tears, etched with the exhaustion of hours spent battling a relentless enemy. As you pass by merchants displaying their wares, women drawing water from a public well, children playing in the dirt, you expect, perhaps, a nod of recognition, a word of thanks, a fleeting moment of gratitude for the homes and lives you helped save. Instead, you often encounter averted eyes, whispers that cease as you approach, a subtle shift in posture that indicates discomfort or even disdain. You are a necessary evil, a grim reminder of destruction, a perpetual outsider. Your profession, while undeniably vital, is seen as dirty, dangerous, and often associated with the very lowest strata of society. Who else, after all, would willingly rush into the heart of a raging fire, risking life and limb for such meager reward? Only those with no other options, no other prospects, no other path to survival. You are often drawn from the ranks of the impoverished, the unskilled laborers, the desperate. Perhaps you were a former soldier, left with little but your brawn and a willingness to face danger. Maybe you were an orphan or a peasant who migrated to the city seeking a better life, only to find yourself pulling water buckets instead of plowing fields. This very origin story marks you. You are not a skilled artisan, not a respected guild member, not a learned scholar. You are a brute, a commoner, a man whose hands are calloused not from craftsmanship, but from grim, desperate labor. The public's perception is harsh. You are seen as a carrier of ill fortune, a harbinger of disaster. When you appear, it is usually because something terrible has happened or is about to. You are forever linked to chaos and destruction. People do not want you at their celebrations or at their quiet family gatherings. You carry the stench of burnt offerings, of death and ruin. Children are sometimes told to behave, lest the firemen take them away, a crude caricature of a figure who deals with darkness and despair. Your quarters, if you have any provided by the city or your employer, are likely cramped, Spartan, and situated in the less desirable parts of town. Your uniform, if you are fortunate enough to have one, is more practical than presentable, designed for durability and function, not for appearance or status. It is a working garment, not a symbol of honor. You might find yourself sharing a dormitory with fellow firefighters, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of flame, but isolated from the broader community. Even economically, you are often undervalued. Pay is sporadic, meager, or sometimes non-existent, replaced by room and board, or a small stipend from the local parish or municipality. You might rely on donations or even have to solicit tips from the very people whose homes you just saved. This act, while sometimes necessary for your survival, further diminishes your standing, reducing you to little more than a beggar, a desperate soul seeking alms. This is not the noble work of a knight, nor the respected craft of a mason. It is a base, almost shameful necessity. Consider the opportunities open to you. Marriage prospects are slim. What respectable family would want their daughter to marry a man who routinely places himself in mortal danger, whose income is uncertain, and whose profession carries such a heavy social weight? You are a poor risk, a constant source of anxiety and a social embarrassment. Your family, if you have one, also bears the brunt of this stigma. Your children might be teased at school, your spouse might be looked down upon by their peers. The shadow of the fire follows not just you, but your entire household. You are not granted the privileges or protections afforded to other essential workers. In times of unrest or plague, you are still expected to perform your duties, often without additional compensation or recognition. When a building burns, you are there. When the city walls are breached, you might be pressed into service. Your life is cheap, your value measured primarily in your ability to confront danger head-on. The contrast between your bravery in the face of absolute terror and the public's indifference or outright scorn is a heavy burden to bear. You witness acts of immense courage from your comrades, you perform them yourself. You see men stand their ground against collapsing timbers, brave suffocating smoke to pull a child from a burning building, or hold a line against an encroaching inferno, knowing full well that retreat could mean the destruction of an entire district. Yet, these acts are rarely celebrated beyond your immediate company. They are simply expected. It is your job. There is no parade in your honor, no medal struck in your name. Instead, you face the psychological toll of a thankless job. You might internalize the contempt, allowing it to gnaw at your self-worth. You might grow bitter, cynical, questioning the value of your sacrifice for a society that seems to care so little for your well-being or your very existence. This emotional burden is as heavy as any bucket of water you ever carried. You are constantly reminded of your place. Even after a heroic rescue, the owner of the saved property might offer a grudging payment, or worse, haggle over a small gratuity, as if your life and effort were merely a transaction. There is no genuine appreciation, no heartfelt thanks, only a transactional exchange, if that. You are a tool, a resource to be used when needed and then forgotten until the next disaster strikes. Think about the subtle but constant indignities. You are probably excluded from many public houses, or relegated to the least desirable corners. Your presence might make others uneasy. Conversations might dry up when you enter a room. You are an uncomfortable reminder of the fragility of life and property, a walking embodiment of disaster. It is easier for people to ignore you or to treat you with suspicion, than to confront the unsettling truths your profession represents. This lack of respect extends even to how your work is organized and managed. You might be under the command of a local magistrate, a watch captain, or a wealthy merchant, individuals who likely have little to no practical experience with fighting fires. Decisions might be made that put you and your team in unnecessary danger, not out of malice, but out of ignorance and a disregard for the lives of those deemed expendable. You are not seen as a professional but as a labor force, a disposable asset. The stories of your heroic deeds, if they are told at all, are likely confined to the smoky common rooms of your firehouse, exchanged amongst those who truly understand the depth of your sacrifice. Outside those walls, your name and your struggles remain largely unknown, unheard, uncelebrated. You are a ghost, moving through the periphery of society, appearing only when the alarm bells ring, and vanishing again into the shadows once the last ember is extinguished. This is the ultimate irony of your existence. You are a protector, a savior, a guardian against one of humanity's oldest and most terrifying threats. Yet, for your courage, your strength, and your unwavering resolve, you receive not accolades but ostracization. Not gratitude but disdain. Not wealth but poverty. Your legacy for centuries is to be the unsung hero, the indispensable yet ignored, the lowliest servant to a society that needed you desperately but refused to acknowledge your true worth. It is a thankless task, indeed, a burden that weighs as heavily as any physical injury, scarring your spirit as deeply as the flames scar the buildings you fight to save. You carry this invisible burden, this societal rejection, through every smoke-filled alley, every collapsing ruin, every desperate attempt to quench the insatiable hunger of the fire. And as you wipe the soot from your brow, you know with a weary resignation that tomorrow it will likely be the same. The fire will rage, you will fight it, and the world will largely turn its back until the next blaze calls your name. The weary resignation you felt, the solitude of your thankless fight, begins to fray at the edges. A flicker of an idea, a murmur among the common folk and the occasional city elder, suggests that perhaps, just perhaps, this monumental threat cannot be faced by individual courage alone. The sheer scale of destruction, the recurring nightmare of entire districts reduced to ash, starts to force a grudging acknowledgement. Survival, even in its most brutal form, demands a collective effort. You are no longer merely a lone figure battling the inferno. You are now part of a nascent, often chaotic, but undeniably communal attempt to push back against the inevitable. You stand on a street corner, the air still thick with the acrid scent of a recent blaze, and hear the first whispers of organization. It is not a grand pronouncement, not a royal decree etched in stone, but a collection of small, pragmatic attempts born of desperation. The first and most vital step is simple recognition. An alarm. The church bells, once symbols of worship and celebration, now take on a new, urgent purpose. When the first tendrils of smoke are spotted, when the orange glow paints the night sky, you hear it, a frantic, irregular pealing that sends a jolt through every sleeping soul. This is not the measured chime for Sunday Mass. This is the clang of terror, a universal signal that demands immediate attention. You feel the tremor in your chest as the sound echoes through the narrow, twisting lanes, pulling you from your bed or perhaps, preventing you from ever truly resting. Suddenly you are not alone in your frantic rush. Neighbors spill from their homes, some still half-dressed, their faces a mixture of fear and grim determination. This is the spontaneous, almost primal organized response, the Bucket Brigade. You join the line, your hands raw and blistered from endless labor. A chain of humanity stretches from the nearest well or river, a continuous flow of water sloshing from one wooden bucket to the next, passed hand to hand with desperate speed. The water is cold and heavy, splashing onto your clothes, stinging your eyes, but you push through the discomfort. Each bucket is a small victory, a tiny offering against the ravenous flames. You feel the rhythm of the chain, the shared burden, the collective gasp when a bucket is dropped, the collective sigh when one more reaches the front. In some towns, the attempts at order went a step further. You might find a town crier or a designated watchman, whose job it is not just to spot the fire, but to direct the frantic crowds. "To the well," he shouts, his voice hoarse. "Form a line. Save the granary." The shouts often dissolve into a cacophony of panicked cries and desperate pleas, but for a fleeting moment, there is direction, a semblance of strategy in the swirling chaos. You are told where to go, what to do, who to help. It is not always efficient, but it is an attempt to channel the raw energy of the crowd into something productive. Local ordinances begin to appear, tiny regulations chipped away at the vast problem. You are now expected, by local law, to keep a full water barrel outside your door, especially during the dry months. A ladder might be mandated or a fire hook ready for use. These are not tools for you, the dedicated firefighter, but for every homeowner. The idea is that everyone becomes a first responder, that the immediate threat can be contained by the very people whose homes are at risk. You see these barrels, often neglected or half-empty, but their presence is a testament to a growing awareness that prevention and readiness are crucial. You might even be conscripted, if a blaze strikes near your district, to bring your own meager equipment to the fight. Beyond the spontaneous brigades and local mandates, the faint outlines of specialized groups begin to emerge. Sometimes these are craft guilds, the carpenters with their tools and knowledge of timber structures, or the masons, adept at breaking down walls to create fire breaks. You find yourself working alongside these skilled tradesmen, not because it is their official duty, but because it benefits their community and ultimately their own livelihood. They might bring their sturdy axes, their strong ropes, their knowledge of how a building is constructed and, crucially, how it might be dismantled to starve a fire. You learn from them, observing their techniques, understanding the nuances of how a fire behaves in different materials. Then there are the religious orders or charitable fraternities. Driven by a sense of civic duty, or perhaps the fear of divine retribution, they form their own rudimentary brigades. You see them, often distinguished by a particular tunic or insignia, working with a shared sense of purpose. They might have slightly better organization, perhaps a designated leader, or a small fund for basic equipment. They represent a slightly more formal step, a dedicated group committing to the ongoing fight. You might feel a kinship with them, recognizing the same selfless drive, even if their motivations are rooted in faith rather than the stark practicality that often drives you. Yet, despite these nascent efforts, the fundamental challenges remain immense. Communication is rudimentary, coordination often breaks down, and equipment is laughably inadequate. You still rely on the same primitive tools: axes, hooks, buckets. The pumps, when they do exist, are simple hand-operated devices, often cumbersome and inefficient, requiring many strong arms to operate for only a meager stream of water. You watch as precious minutes are lost, not to lack of effort, but to the sheer physical limitations of the technology at hand. The water supply is always an issue, the narrow streets are choked with panicked residents and fleeing livestock, and the wooden buildings burn with terrifying speed. You witness the frustrations firsthand. The chaotic enthusiasm of the early moments often gives way to exhaustion and despair as the fire continues its relentless march. The organized response quickly descends into a desperate free-for-all, as individuals revert to saving their own possessions, or their own families, abandoning the collective effort when faced with personal catastrophe. You see this unraveling, this breakdown of nascent order, and it underscores the monumental task ahead. These whispers of progress are easily drowned out by the roar of the inferno, the crackle of burning timbers, and the screams of those who have lost everything. Still, these early attempts, however flawed, mark a crucial turning point. They are the initial recognition that firefighting needs more than just brave individuals. It needs structure, it needs tools, it needs a system. You are part of this living experiment, a witness to the slow, arduous birth of a concept. You might be ordered to help tear down a building to create a firebreak, wielding a heavy crowbar or axe, hacking at beams already weakened by heat. The air is thick with smoke and dust, your muscles ache, but you persist because you understand the grim logic. Sacrifice a few to save many. This is a strategic decision, a form of organized response, albeit a brutal one. The sheer unpredictability of fire, combined with the dense, combustible nature of European towns, meant that even the best-intentioned efforts often failed. You stand amidst the smoldering ruins the morning after, surveying the damage. The communal effort, while it saved some, could not stop the complete annihilation of others. The buckets, the bells, the shouted instructions, the brave efforts of guildsmen and friars, all were often swallowed by the inferno. But a seed has been planted. The idea that a community has a shared responsibility, a shared strategy, however basic, begins to take root. These are not the professional, disciplined companies that will one day emerge. These are not the well-equipped forces of the future. Instead, you are part of a rough, ready, and often terrifyingly inefficient system. You see the faces of your neighbors, united in fear and labor, and for the first time, you feel a faint, fragile sense of belonging in the fight. You are still an outcast, still an object of suspicion, but in these moments of shared peril and shared effort, the line between us and them blurs, if only momentarily. The progress is incremental, almost imperceptible, a faint echo in the vastness of human suffering. But it is there, a quiet affirmation that the tide, however slowly, might one day turn. The embers of collective action glow, dim but persistent, promising a distant future where the fight against fire might finally be met with something more powerful than individual despair.